Popular culture is a beautiful, strange, and rather crowded battlefield. Most works go barely noticed. Some explode overnight before vanishing just as fast. But sometimes something else happens. I'm talking about those very rare pieces of art which reach such an extreme level of saturation, which become so deeply embedded into the collective cultural consciousness, that they sort of become invisible in a way. Take the Beatles or Shakespeare as examples. Such ubiquitous forces in popular culture, so universally recognised, so heavily mythologized, that their names alone feel like enough, don't they? At a certain point, we stop thinking of these people as artists and start treating them more like cultural furniture. Work that is, for sure, to be revered and acknowledged, but rarely actually engaged in properly. Let's face it, you no longer need to listen to Revolver to know that the Beatles were important. You no longer need to have read Hamlet to know that Shakespeare was a genius. Why? Well, because unless you're over the age of 70 or 450, their greatness was already cemented long before we were old enough to form lasting memories. We arrived into a world with their names already carved into the canon. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I think this inheritance of reputation, let's call it, well, it really affects how we interact with the art itself. Sometimes it even makes us forget to look at the thing directly, simply because everyone else already has. This is a story of one of those times. So when I was growing up in the United Kingdom, I used to always watch this show on Channel 4 at 6 o'clock called The Simpsons. I didn't know anything about its history or different eras or its influence on the world. I just knew it as the show that had always been there. Kind of like the news or the meat industry. You didn't really need to think about where The Simpsons came from or why it was on. It just was. Like the rising of the sun or the turning of the earth. In many ways, it felt like The Simpsons had always been running, since the days of cave paintings and fighting woolly mammoths with sticks. And I enjoyed my time spent in Springfield as a kid. Of course, I didn't fully understand all the satire and the deeper cultural references, but overall I loved it. There was quite a lot of comfort to be found in watching something so familiar and universal, especially with the show's episodic nature, which always reset the world back to normal by the end of each story. It was full of characters and locations I felt like I'd known my whole life, and it had this oddly specific sense of humour which I think people of any age can enjoy. But that's about where my analysis ended. And one day, I guess I just stopped watching it. I'm not entirely sure why. I imagine it has something to do with the temporal soup of adolescence, that strange way childhood habits dissolve without you noticing. But yeah, eventually those days of sitting down at 6 o'clock to watch these yellow people go about their lives, well, it ended. Like all things do. And after that, I probably didn't watch another episode of The Simpsons for 10 years. In fact, I barely even thought about it, to be honest. I guess it just drifted quietly into the background of my life. Something that was still constantly on TV, still constantly referenced by others both in the real world and the internet, but no longer something I engaged with directly. The Simpsons essentially became background noise, and I think this is something that perhaps others can relate to as well. I mean, I was born in 2001, which means I'm a classic Gen Zer, and I think for a lot of people my age, The Simpsons occupies this very strange cultural space in our minds, because it's not something we remember discovering, so it's not something we ever felt the need to return to. And this is the thing about these long-running cultural artifacts. The more ubiquitous they are, the less curiosity they seem to invite. Looking back, the constant, omnipotent presence of The Simpsons was so overwhelming that the idea of actually sitting down to watch the show properly, as an adult, felt almost redundant. I mean, that would be like relearning the alphabet, or I don't know, listening to a piano cover of Hot Cross Buns. And that's fine, of course. It's not the end of the world that a guy from the UK stopped watching The Simpsons. But here's the thing. Over time, that distance, that experience of not actively engaging in something, but still being constantly surrounded by it through memes and merchandise and all that, well, it really began to reshape the way I thought about the show itself. After all, how sharp or intelligent could something as popular and fundamental as The Simpsons truly be? How subversive or groundbreaking is a show gonna be that is broadcast every day on mainstream television, that has been so fully absorbed by popular culture that it's now functionally invisible? Well, in the ego-driven backroom of my own developing mind, you know, the part that confuses cynicism with taste, I started to form the opinion that The Simpsons was this rather safe and inoffensive entity. Now, that's not to say I thought it was bad, per se, or that any of this pretentiousness was happening consciously, but regardless, I came to see the show as something ambient and toothless and corporate, more like a brand than art. A familiar yellow blur in an ocean of content. And it's strange looking back to realise just how confidently I held that view without ever actually returning to the source. Because let's face it, this assumption was incredibly misguided, and was based not on the show itself, but on its reputation and place in popular culture. And it was only when I started watching it properly again this year, specifically the show's golden age, that I realised how thoroughly I had been hoodwinked by my own mind and ego and preconceived notions. Because it turns out, and this will be no surprise to most of you I'm sure, that The Simpsons is in fact not background entertainment, but an incredibly influential and intelligent piece of television.
What? Nah, I never knew that.
The iconic Yellow family made their first television appearance in 1987, in a series of short animated sketches that aired on The Tracey Ullman Show. Although creator Matt Groening had already been making a name for himself with his indie comic Life in Hell, a series about talking rabbits navigating adult misery, which showcased the guy's dry wit and anti-establishment energy. When producer James L. Brooks originally asked him to pitch an idea for TV, Groening, worried about losing the rights to his comic, quickly sketched out a dysfunctional family loosely based on his own. Now, these original Tracey Ullman cartoons are pretty rough by modern standards, with jittery animation and lopsided proportions, but there's definitely still this spark of originality to be found in them. And by 1989, that spark had grown into a full-fledged half-hour primetime show. Now, it can be easy to take for granted just how different and fresh The Simpsons was when it first dropped, considering its current ubiquity and how much every other adult animated show since has borrowed massively from its DNA. But back in 1989, American TV was a very different beast, or so I've been told. The landscape was crowded with what you might call traditional squeaky clean sitcoms such as Full House and Family Ties and The Cosby Show. You know, programs built around familial stability and the reinforcement of social norms. Parents were wise, children were teachable, and authority, or the status quo if you want to call it that, was consistently respected and upheld. The Simpsons, though, arriving after these shows had cemented the blueprint, approached the family sitcom as something to be hollowed out and reassembled. It for sure kept the familiar structure, the nuclear family, the suburban home, the 30-minute runtime, but repurposed those elements into something far bolder and, quite frankly, far more honest. It acknowledged the gap between the ideals projected by traditional sitcoms and the realities of most viewers' lives. Homer is for sure a patriarch who loves his family, but he's also impatient, distracted, impulsive, loud, frequently irresponsible, drinks too much, rarely listens, and almost never learns. Marge is perhaps the most quietly tragic character of the show, carrying the weight of domestic responsibility without the dignity or gratitude typically afforded to maternal figures in sitcoms. Bart is a universal emblem of the troublemaker, having grown up in a system and family that never expected much of him. Detention is a routine, and authority means nothing. Lisa, the most intelligent member of the family and the closest thing the show has to a conscience, exists in a state of near total alienation. She's smart enough to see the dysfunction of her family and town, but is trapped in it nonetheless. And then you have Maggie, who's just kind of there. Now, The Simpsons was not the first show to present a dysfunctional family like this. Married with Children premiered 2 years earlier, and All in the Family had already carved out space for domestic chaos back in the 70s. But The Simpsons arrived in prime time as an animated series, which gave it a different kind of access. At the time, animated television was still broadly coded as children's entertainment, and that expectation lowered the defenses of both audiences and censors, allowing The Simpsons to reach wider demographics while getting away with material that might have seemed too sharp or cynical in a live-action context. It also meant that, as an animated show, The Simpsons could move faster and scale its world in stranger, more expressive ways than live-action ever could. The medium gave it this kind of elasticity, a freedom to exaggerate, distort, compress reality. And the creators brilliantly utilized this freedom to construct their own absurd vision of America. If a show like Full House presented a version of the States in which systems worked, in which teachers cared, bosses listened, and moral clarity emerged by the third act, The Simpsons, through the brilliantly realized microcosmic town of Springfield, depicted a culture of stagnation. You know, the mayor is openly corrupt, the police are bumbling idiots, the school system is underfunded and demoralized, and the richest guy in town is a theatrically malevolent old man who runs the local nuclear power plant, with open disdain for his employees and human life in general. Even the local pastor, my guy Reverend Lovejoy, seems spiritually exhausted, and increasingly indifferent to the very people he's meant to guide. Now, that's not to say that The Simpsons was cynical for the sake of it, and it certainly wasn't nihilistic, as we'll get to in a bit. But it did treat the world, and specifically America, with a degree of suspicion not commonly found in either sitcoms or cartoons. The mechanisms of American society still existed in the streets of Springfield, but the show made no effort to disguise how ineffectively they functioned. And this is the thing which I think so many people my age fail to appreciate about The Simpsons, that when it first dropped, it was genuinely this fresh and innovative piece of counterculture. It was cheeky and witty and biting. It had this real underdog sort of energy. It punched up, it questioned authority, mocked institutions, and brought a sort of punk ethos into primetime. I mean, for God's sake, back in 1992, then President George H.W. Bush famously remarked that he wanted American families to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. The Waltons being a wholesome Depression-era family from a 1970s show about hard work and intergenerational virtue. And not only did The Simpsons respond to this comment immediately,
"Hey, we're just like the Waltons. We're praying for an end to the Depression too."
but a few years later they went even further, producing an entire episode where Bush, voiced by Harry Shearer, moves in across the street from The Simpsons. And honestly, it's difficult to overstate just how audacious and cheeky that is, and how casually the show pulled it off. But again, nowadays I feel like the countercultural, experimental roots of The Simpsons are all too easily forgotten, regardless of the influence it's had on the entire contemporary TV landscape. Like all things that become ubiquitous, a lot of the show's edge has been smoothed out in retrospect. It's no longer seen as something disruptive or risky, just familiar. I get the impression that many younger people see The Simpsons as this safe, legacy brand, this sort of pop culture institution, always there, always on in the background, and I think that makes it dangerously easy to overlook how bold it once was. It really reminds me of the people who briefly listen to Hey Jude or Yesterday and immediately decide that the Beatles were boring, safe, and overrated, completely unaware of how much they changed popular culture or of all the strange, ambitious, and genuinely groundbreaking music they made. But here's the thing with The Simpsons. Yes, it was a bold, cutting-edge, countercultural show. Yes, it was hilarious. Yes, it geniusly combined the familiarity of the family sitcom with the surrealness of the cartoon format. But it also had buckets of heart. And that, I think, is the real secret sauce. Because beneath all the satire and gags and pop culture references, The Simpsons had this emotional core, a warmth and sincerity that grounded everything. The show genuinely cared about its characters. It could have easily been this cold, nihilistic, ironic thing, but it wasn't. Instead, it allowed itself to feel. It let its characters hope and fail and connect with each other, even in the smallest of ways. And that emotional sincerity, that balance between sharp cynicism and honest warmth, is something very few shows, animated or otherwise, have managed to replicate. That balance between exaggeration and social observation, between parody and poignancy, that's where The Simpsons found its distinct voice, and it's what made those early episodes feel like lightning in a bottle. But here's the deal. You may have noticed that I've sort of been referring to The Simpsons in the past tense for most of this video, which is kind of a weird thing to do, right? Considering the show is still going, and just got done airing its 36th season a few months ago. But the truth is, not all seasons of The Simpsons are created equally, and I think this speaks to yet another reason as to why the show can sometimes be overlooked, or even disrespected by younger people. See, when I dove back into The Simpsons, I quickly learned that the show doesn't exist as one cohesive thing. No, it has eras. Distinct periods with wildly different tones, writing styles, and most importantly, levels of quality. And the most celebrated of those eras, the one people are talking about when they call The Simpsons a masterpiece, is what's known as the Golden Age. Now, there's a little disagreement over what actually constitutes as the Golden Age. Some people say it's seasons 1 through 10, some say 2 through 9, and some purists reckon it's just 4 to 7. But regardless of where you draw the line, there's a clear window in the show's history where everything just clicked. The writing was sharper, the characters were richer, the jokes landed harder, as did the emotional moments. It felt like every week they were pulling off something kind of miraculous, balancing absurd cartoon logic with painfully relatable truths about both America and the human condition in general. This was the era that gave us Marge vs. the Monorail, Last Exit to Springfield, Lisa's Substitute, You Only Move Twice, Homer's Enemy, episodes that weren't just funny, but emotionally and thematically rich, often bordering on profound. The Simpsons in these years wasn't just good TV, it was essential art, an overwhelming force in popular culture, and a show that genuinely redefined what television could be. It proved that a cartoon airing on a major network, no less, could be smarter, sharper, and more emotionally resonant than almost anything else on the air. But of course, all good things must come to an end, or in the case of The Simpsons, all good things must slowly morph into something else entirely. It's no secret that over time, the show began to slip. As writers left and others came in, a sense of discipline and artistry was lost. Jokes that once went through a dozen drafts in tightly packed writers' rooms where every line was debated, rewritten, punched up, and stress-tested for maximum impact, were now being churned out with far less precision. The emotional core thinned, the satire, once biting and bold, became safer, more self-referential, even toothless at times, and characters that once felt complex and human gradually morphed into hollow versions of themselves. I mean, for God's sake, the term flanderization, meaning the progressive exaggeration of a single trait or a set of traits of a fictional character until it overtakes all other characterization, it literally comes from this show, from Ned Flanders, obviously. And this slow creative decline had real consequences, especially for how the show is perceived today. Because if you're a casual fan who decides to watch The Simpsons in 2025, whether through reruns on cable or buried in the endless scroll of Disney+, you're probably not watching a Golden Age episode, at least if you just put it on at random. Talking purely in terms of probability here, you're more likely than not seeing an episode from the later seasons, the mass-produced, corporatized, long-running institution many people like to refer to as Zombie Simpsons. You're not seeing the show that once pushed boundaries or reshaped television, you're seeing something that feels more like a brand than a piece of art. And that brand is everywhere. T-shirts, lunchboxes, crossover episodes, endless merchandising. What began as a sharp, anti-establishment, countercultural cartoon eventually became one of the most commercial properties on the planet. Just another piece of the Disney machine, another once subversive thing swallowed by the mainstream and and repackaged as safe, nostalgic content. And yeah, it's kind of sad, but it's also a tale as old as time. Most revolutionary art, if it gets big enough, eventually gets absorbed into the culture it once critiqued. And The Simpsons is one of the clearest examples of that transformation. It started out punching up at systems, at authority, at America itself, but over time it became part of the system. It went from mocking the machine to being the machine. And nowhere is that more painfully clear than in this Disney era. There's something uniquely upsetting about seeing these characters, once so sharp and self-aware, awkwardly squeezed into crossover shorts and marketing campaigns for the very kind of corporate empire they were created to parody. I get this quiet existential ache seeing these cartoon corpses reanimated as Marvel characters. Their outlines still familiar, but their spirit long gone. It's like watching a former punk band do jingles for car commercials. The show that once brilliantly satirized American consumerism and corporate power is now a permanent fixture within one of the most powerful media conglomerates in the world. And this slow decay, stretched over decades, has made it even easier just to forget how rich The Simpsons once was. But the truth is, when something has been on TV for just under 15% of the entire history of the USA, it can stop feeling like art and start feeling like furniture. It becomes invisible through overexposure, something we think we know even if we've never really looked. And it's this cultural over-familiarity, along with the show's prime being firmly in the past, that led me, and I think a lot of others, to believe The Simpsons was just another long-running, safe animated show. But the truth is, peak Simpsons is peak television. Genuinely. Some of the smartest, funniest, and most emotionally intelligent popular art made in the last 35 years. And it was there, the whole time, hiding in plain sight, buried under its own reputation. And sure, maybe people a little older than me already knew that. Maybe they lived through the golden age and never forgot it. But for a lot of people my age, people who grew up with the reruns, the memes, the merchandise, The Simpsons was just there. It came pre-canonized, pre-mythologized, and in that process we perhaps stopped seeing it for what it really was, or at least what it used to be. But regardless of what happens to the Simpsons brand next, how many more seasons Disney churns out, how many more shorts or crossovers appear, that peak, that golden age, those brilliantly creative and influential and iconic episodes, they were always there, and they always will be. And nothing or no one can take that away from us. And I find great comfort in that, personally. But that's it. That's the video. Never really sure how to end these things. One trick is just to tell stories that don't really go anywhere. Like the time I caught the ferry to Shelbyville. I needed a new heel for my shoe. So I decided to go to Morganville, which is what they called Shelbyville in those days. So I tied an onion to my belt, which was the style at the time. Now, to take the ferry cost a nickel, and in those days, nickels had pictures of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 bees for a quarter, you'd say. Now, where were we? Oh yeah, the important thing was that I had an onion on my belt, which was the style at the time. They didn't have any white onions because of the war. The only thing you could get were those big yellow ones.